All right. Welcome, everybody, to Standing for Truth. My name is Donny and this is Sam, and we are your hosts for today's exciting program. We are thrilled to have Dr. Frank Turek here to defend the Christian faith and help us show why Christianity is true. It really is an honor and a privilege to have one of my favorite Christian apologists here to answer important questions on all things Christianity. Frank, firstly, I know how busy you are, so I appreciate you giving us your time for today. And how are you doing?
I think, Donnie, you need a more dramatic opening. I didn't know when that emblem was going to actually stop turning and we were actually going to be doing a show, but it kept going and the music and everything. I thought, Jesus was about to return. That was pretty good.
Well, you know what? After spending most of the night reading your book, Hollywood Heroes, and reading all about how Batman and Superman and Lord of the Rings tell us a lot about the world of Christianity, I knew I had to give everybody something epic in terms of our intro for tonight. So, Frank, as always, it's great to have you. And since we're doing this live to the live audience, we are going to be taking your questions on Christianity and how to defend the Christian faith. And so before I hand it to Sam to ask the first question to help set the foundation, I do want to recommend a couple books here by Frank Turek. Hollywood Heroes, excellent book. I got some questions based on that for sure. One of the first books I've ever read as a new Christian about 7 or 8 years ago. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. Very true. And then Stealing from God. So we'll be having some questions related to each of those books for today. And so, Sam, I'm going to hand it to you, brother. Firstly, how are you today, Sam? And let's get into the first question for today.
Yeah, I'm doing great. Frank, big fan. I also just finished I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Fantastic book. I highly recommend that. Very thorough. So with that in mind here, my first question for you to set the foundation of today's program, Frank, with all of the different evidences there are for God, be it either arguments or physical evidence, what would you say would be your favorite and also your least favorite?
Of arguments? Well, I actually think the cosmological argument gives you the most attributes of God, because if space, time, and matter had a beginning, then it seems, and even atheists are admitting this, it would seem that the cause at least must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, personal, and intelligent. You get at least 6 attributes out of one argument for God. And that sets it up perfectly for the resurrection, because a lot of people say, well, I can't believe in the resurrection. I've never seen one. I don't seem to see miracles today. What they're forgetting is they're living in a miracle. This universe is a miracle. And if Genesis 1:1 is true, and even atheists are admitting the evidence for the first verse, even if they don't think it's God, but if Genesis 1:1 is indeed true, then every other verse in the Bible is at least believable. And so the resurrection then becomes possible if Genesis 1:1 is true, if God exists. So I like the cosmological argument. I always start with that. I don't use an argument like the ontological argument because it's too controversial, and although some think it's good and other people think it's not, there's no reason to use a controversial argument when you've got good arguments that are much more easily understood and accepted. So I'd say my favorite would be the cosmological. My least favorite would be the ontological.
Yeah, and I know with Norman Geisler, the book that you wrote, I do not have enough faith to be an atheist. I'm a fan of Norman Geisler also, and you guys make I think it's a 12-point connection with I think the column is in there, basically ending with the truth of at least the reliability of the New Testament.
Yeah, when we do it, when I do a presentation at a church or a college campus, I'm just covering 4 questions. Does truth exist? Does God exist? Are miracles possible? And is the New Testament true with regard to the resurrection? Because if the answer to those 4 questions is yes, then Christianity is true. Yeah. If the answer to any of those questions is no, Christianity is not true. So In the book, however, we go into a lot more detail because you have more time in a book, obviously. You can lay things out. So we go from does truth exist in the book through 12 steps to the point where you can say the Bible is the word of God, the inerrant word of God.
I'd like to ask you a question, Frank. And so I think it's clear that, as you've pointed out in your book, that all time, matter, and space had a beginning. You argue for that in an excellent way. And I've heard some atheists, I've heard you recently engaging an atheist in an open mic debate, and they would argue that time, matter, and space could have originated from some primordial, perhaps, energy and material. Is that plausible? And what would be a good response to that?
Well, I mean, you can say anything you want. You can say that, the original creator of the universe is turtles and it's turtles all the way down. People have said that, right? I mean, you can say that. The question is, what evidence do you have for that? The best evidence we have now is that space-time and matter had a beginning. And if space-time and matter had a beginning, then whatever created space-time and matter can't be made as space-time and matter. In other words, the cause must transcend space-time and matter. So the best evidence we have is that whatever created the universe is spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, personal, and intelligent. Is it possible we're wrong? Of course it is. It's always possible, but you go with the best evidence that you have. All right. The problem is, and I think everybody knows this intuitively, you can't go on an infinite regress of causes. Ultimately, you got to get back to an uncaused first cause.
Right.
And either the uncaused first cause is the universe or it's something outside the universe. All the evidence we know about, even from atheists, suggests that the universe is not the uncaused first cause, that it had a beginning. And by the way, it wasn't this way from the scientific perspective until the last century. Scientists up until the last century thought the universe was eternal. Since the last century, they're going, oh, it's not eternal. It had a beginning. So, there's got to be an uncaused first cause, and it seems a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, personal, intelligent creator is the uncaused first cause.
As you said, Frank, for many years, people believed, and I think it's called the steady state theory, that the universe is eternal and there wasn't a true beginning. But now the consensus seems to be that there was a beginning. And so I'm wondering what the lines of evidence for that position would be.
Scientifically, the evidence, we have an acronym, SURGE, S-U-R-G-E, in the book. Second law of thermodynamics says the universe is running down. In other words, as time goes on, the amount of energy in the universe is decreasing. Well, if the universe was eternal, we would have run out of energy a long time ago. Since we still have energy, the lights are still on, the universe must have had a beginning. The second, the U, stands for the universe is expanding. Edwin Hubble saw that from his telescope back in the 1920s, that all the galaxies are moving away from us. He sees the redshift in the light. If we take that all the way back in time, if we could rewind time, you would see everything collapse back literally to a point of infinite density. It's called a singularity. It means space-time and matter had a beginning point. And that's what the evidence seems to suggest from the U. The R stands for the radiation afterglow. That's the remnant heat from the initial Big Bang explosion. It's still out there. This was discovered by accident by two scientists by the name of Penzias and Wilson, operating at Bell Labs in Homedale, New Jersey, not far from where I grew up. They won Nobel Prizes for discovering the smoking gun to the Big Bang. This was the remnant heat from the initial explosion. The G stands for the great galaxy seeds found in that radiation afterglow, discovered by the Kobe space satellite in 1992. Those showed that the variation in the temperature of the initial explosion was so precisely fine-tuned that it would allow the galaxies to form in the early universe. And the E in SURGE stands for Einstein's theory of general relativity, which shows that space, time, and matter are correlative. They came into existence together. And Einstein's theory continually has been reconfirmed as being true. And then, of course, you've got the evidence just from philosophy to say that if there were an infinite number of days before today, this day today would never have gotten here. Why? Because if there's an infinite number of days before today, you'd always have to live another day before you got to this one. But since today is here, there can only be a finite number of days before today. So time itself must have had a beginning. And if time had a beginning, whatever created time must be timeless. So right. I would say those 6 lines of evidence 5 of them are from science and 1 of them is from philosophy, shows beyond any reasonable doubt that space-time and matter had a beginning.
That's a great answer. If time did not have a beginning, I like the way you put that, then today could never have gotten here.
Yeah,
so the cause of time must be timeless.
That's right. And if the cause is timeless, the cause didn't have a beginning, which answers the question, well, who made God? No one made God. He's the uncaused first cause. He's outside of time. If you're outside of time, did you have a beginning? No. So you don't have a cause.
When famous atheist apologists use that argument, well, then who created your God? If the universe had to have a creator, the creation needs a creator. Is that misunderstanding the God of the Bible and what we mean by God to ask that question, Frank?
To ask what question now? If
an atheist, you see a lot of these atheist apologists, they'll ask, well, if the universe had to have a beginning, well, then God would have also had to have a beginning. Who created God, they'll ask?
Well, because the principle of causality doesn't say everything needs a cause. The principle of causality says everything that comes to be needs a cause.
Right.
As I just mentioned, everyone knows there has to be an uncaused first cause. In fact, prior to the last century, scientists thought the universe was eternal. And did they ever ask, well, who created the universe? No, they didn't say. They said the universe didn't need a cause. It's always been here. Now, when we learn that this universe had a beginning and something outside the universe must be the uncaused first cause, suddenly they're going, well, who caused the uncaused first cause? Why didn't you ask that of the universe 100 years ago, right?
That's a good point.
So, look, if the universe is eternal, it doesn't need a beginning cause anyway. I would argue it would still need a present cause to keep things going as they're going. That's what Aristotle said, and Aquinas followed with that. Aristotle mistakenly thought the universe was eternal, but he still said it needs an unmoved mover because the universe is going in a particular direction, so someone must be directing it. But scientists or atheists never had a problem with believing in an uncaused universe, but suddenly they have a problem with an uncaused God. Why is that?
I find it interesting that the naturalist and the atheist, they have this criteria that everything needs to be demonstrable before they can believe it. But now with the Big Bang or the beginning of the universe, now that's established, everyone agrees that there was a beginning. It seems like they become very inconsistent by then appealing to some mysterious multiverse or some infinite cosmos energy, whatever it might be. It's mysterious. And to me, it seems inconsistent with their worldview. So I guess the question that I would have for you is, how important is it to understand the entailments of a worldview, what a worldview is, and how the physical world is interpreted based on a prior commitment to a worldview? Yeah,
well, this is why we say in the book, Stealing from God, that science doesn't say anything scientists do.
Yeah.
Why? Because all data needs to be gathered and all data needs to be interpreted. And who does that? Scientists do that. And if they have a worldview that has already ruled out intelligence, has already ruled out God, it doesn't matter how much the evidence points to intelligence. They're always going to say it has to be a natural cause. Well, that's a philosophical presupposition. It's not a result of the evidence. It's a result of their mindset going into the evidence, right? And so I think it's very important to have a worldview that is open to both types of causes. There's only 2 types of causes, either intelligent or non-intelligent. There's no other category. Either it was caused by some sort of intelligent agent or it was caused by a non-intelligent natural process. And I think it's illegitimate to rule out intelligent agents before you look at the evidence.
Yeah, it's funny because I was just reading recently a Pew Research study, and the study was saying how most people, even atheists and agnostics, believe in a type of an afterlife and even heaven and hell. And so that's why I wanted to ask, where is that within their worldview? How inconsistent is that?
Well, let's be clear that it's probably fair to say that most of us have beliefs that are inconsistent with our worldview, right? I mean, for atheists to say they believe in an afterlife, we go, oh, come on. Don't you see how crazy that is? But we probably have a few things in our, in our belief system that if you really were to press up against the Christian worldview, you'd go, no, that doesn't work either. The one you point out, though, Sam, is quite obvious. I mean, how do you miss that? How do you say there's an afterlife if there's no God or no one who is in control after we die? It would seem quite odd to suggest that. But they do.
So, Frank, as you said, every effect has a cause. The universe is an effect. And so what we get is, and I like the way you put it, spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, personal, and intelligent cause. And so I've heard atheists argue that basically initial things, so the universe, time, matter, and space, initial things don't have to have a cause. And so we don't have to say that time, matter, and space had a cause. Are you familiar with that follow-up, and what would be a good response to it?
Well, what they're trying to say is that causes are just physical. They're not metaphysical. Mm-hmm. The problem is, if that were the case, then they shouldn't believe anything they think. Because if their thoughts are completely physical and there's no metaphysical component, nothing beyond the physical, nothing immaterial, then they're driven completely by the laws of physics. So why should we believe anything they think, including any argument they give for atheism? The very process that we go through to think requires both material and immaterial aspects. Sure, you have a material brain, but you have a consciousness and you have these immaterial laws of logic, and you have a mind that is, while to a certain extent dependent on the material, not completely driven by the material. Because if your mind is completely driven by the material, you don't really have a mind, you just have a brain. And again, how can you trust what the laws of physics have driven you to think? If you don't have the free will to follow the evidence where it leads, then you shouldn't believe anything you think. And that's why C.S. Lewis famously said, and I'm paraphrasing what he said here. Well, actually, I should probably just pull it up, because the argument, I mean, the quote he gives is so powerful. Let me just see if I can find it here. He points out that unless your brain is designed, unless there is a mind out there and you have the capacity to follow the evidence where it leads, you shouldn't believe anything you think. Here's what Lewis said. And what he's doing is he's pointing out why materialism, which is the predominant view of atheists now, that we're just molecular machines, that we don't have a mind, we just have a brain. We don't have a soul, we just have a body. We don't have free will, we're driven completely by the laws of physics. In other words, we're just moist robots.
Yeah.
If that's the case, here's what Lewis says about this. He says, suppose there were no intelligence behind the universe. In that case, nobody designed my brain for the purpose of thinking. Thought is merely the byproduct of some atoms within my skull. But if so, how can I trust my own thinking to be true? But if I can't trust my own thinking, of course, I can't trust the arguments leading to atheism, and therefore have no reason to be an atheist or anything else. Unless I believe in God, I can't believe in thought, so I can never use thought to disbelieve in God.
Alvin Plantinga, he argued something similar with his argument against naturalism. And so did Anthony Flew, by the way, before he became a deist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Plantinga's argument in, what's the name of the book? It has naturalism in the title. I can't think of it right now. But same kind of thing that Lewis points this out like 70 years ago in the book Miracles. So he points out the problem with this reductionist materialistic viewpoint, that if every cause is material, why believe anything you think? And so look, the odds-on favorite is that if everything inside the universe needs a cause, everything that comes to be, then the universe itself needs a cause. And if you're going to doubt the law of causality, why don't you doubt all of science then? Because science is built on the law of causality, that every effect has a cause. And if you're going to say that some effects cannot have causes, how can you be secure in science? You can't.
Right. And I think those are some great points. In your debate, one of your debates with Michael Shermer about what best explains morality, you spent a lot of your cross-exam, and I think it was smart to press him on that issue. If our thoughts are just physical with nothing metaphysical, why should we trust our own thoughts and therefore the arguments that our thoughts basically come up with? And a lot of Michael Shermer's response, and I'm just paraphrasing here, I'll try and remember it as best as I can. He would point to how our thinking process or our morals evolve over time. Hundreds of years ago, we were seeking witches and we had unrealistic beliefs, but now today, we're progressing, I guess, with our thoughts. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that, Frank, and why that's incorrect to argue that way.
Well, first of all, he's assuming his mind is working properly and it's not driven by the laws of physics completely. Mm-hmm. He's assuming exactly what he says doesn't exist. He's assuming that he has free will in order to follow the evidence where it leads. Right. You see, any argument for materialism must presuppose materialism's false. Why? Right. Because you got to be a free will creature to follow the evidence where it leads. If the reason you're a materialist is because physics told you so, and you didn't have free will, why should you believe that's true? So that would be my first response. My second response is assuming a standard when he says that. If he's talking about morality, the question is, well, why does he think we're getting morally better? If there is no God, there is no standard, no objective standard. It's just his opinion. He's simply saying, I like it better, right? In fact, in the first debate I had with him at Stony Brook back in 2015, it's on our YouTube channel, the Cross-Examine YouTube channel, he brought up same-sex marriage. And I said to him, oh, why is same-sex marriage a good thing? According to what standard? Where are you getting this from? Mm-hmm. You have to have a standard outside yourself in order to say this particular behavior is better than, say, another particular behavior. But on atheism, there's no better or worse. They're just different. If there's no objective purpose to life, there's no right or wrong way to live it. It's just, things just are what they are. And look, atheists know this. Richard Dawkins has famously said, in a universe of material causes, there is no good or bad. There is no right or wrong. There is no justice or injustice. There's just blind, pitiless indifference. We just dance to our DNA, he said. Now, of course, he doesn't think what he wrote there is just a result of his DNA dancing, right? He thinks that was reasonably concluded. But he said it nonetheless, even though we shouldn't believe it if he is just dancing to his DNA. So, yeah, and then I was just going to say that the biggest problem, it seems to me, with atheists like this is they exempt themselves from their own theories. On one hand, they'll say everybody's a molecular machine, but they don't think they're a molecular machine, right? I mean, Daniel Dennett, who just died a couple of months ago, said consciousness is an illusion. One wonders if he was conscious when he wrote that, right? I mean, but he doesn't think his consciousness is an illusion, right? He thinks he's got consciousness to realize what the real world is about so he can write books about it. So that's the biggest problem I see, is that atheists exempt themselves from their own theories.
Yeah, Richard Dawkins does that. He'll say on one hand, we're just dancing to the tune of our own DNA, but then on the other hand, he'll become indignant about things that he's read in the Bible.
Yeah, that's right. He'll say God is a cosmic dictator. Well, that was where Hitchens, a cosmic North Korean dictator. Dawkins said the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all of fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a vindictive, unjust, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser. He goes on and on and on. Right? Well, what's wrong with any of that if there's no God? If we're just dancing to our DNA, you can't even evaluate whether the Christian God is good or bad, because there is no good or bad.
Right.
Well, along those lines, we have several questions coming in. One here from the chat has to do with the free will and then determinism, how there's different views in terms of determinism and free will. So I'm wondering, Frank, what's the best way to approach that topic?
Well, I would ask a Calvinist, what do you mean by free will and what do you mean by deterministic? Do you think you have free will to accept Jesus or not? And do you think, if you're saying no, do you think that applies to every decision in your life? Now, some of the Calvinists I know would say, I don't have the free will to choose Jesus, but I do have the free will to make other choices. And my question would be, on what grounds do you say that's true? And why would God give us free will to make choices on, say, everyday mundane things, but not the biggest choice of all that we need to make, whether or not to accept Jesus? Doesn't seem to make sense. Now, we could talk a lot about the problems with Calvinism. I don't know if you want to go down that road, but I don't know if we're predestined to or not. But I think the problem is that Calvinism makes God the author of evil And it runs into the same problem the determinists run into, that we don't have free will, so why should we believe anything we think? It makes God the author of evil because he only decides to save some and not others when he could save us all. He could save us all if it's not up to us, right? If he wants everyone to be free or everyone to be saved, as it says several times in the scriptures, and he does all the saving without any free will on our part, then why isn't everyone saved?
Right.
Yeah.
So bicompatibilism, is that kind of what they mean, in the sense that, okay, we, if Calvinism is true, don't have the free will to choose Christ. Christ chooses us, but we have the free will to make other daily choices, moment by moment choices.
Perhaps they may say that. I still would ask them, why do you think you have one kind of freedom and not another?
Right.
Where does the scripture say you don't have free will?
Right. I think those are some great points. And so I guess this brings me again to your debate, one of your debates with Michael Shermer, and the problem of evil. And I really like the approach you took, Frank. In your opening statement, you, rather than playing defense, you showed why the evil exists is actually a good line of evidence for God and the necessity of God. I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Well, because evil presupposes good and good presupposes God. Right? Evil can't exist on its own. Evil is a lack in a good thing. You know, evil is like cancer. You know, if you take all the cancer out of a good body, you got a better body. What happens if you take all the body out of the cancer? You got nothing. It doesn't exist on its own. It can't exist on its own. It's a parasite in a good thing. You know, evil is like rust in a car. If you take all the rust out of a car, you got a better car. If you take all the car out of the rust, you got a Pinto. You guys don't remember the Pinto. You're too young. You don't have anything, right? It can only exist in a good thing. And so God, this is why, by the way, and C.S. Lewis points this out in Mere Christianity. He says, this is why Christians have always recognized that Satan is a fallen angel, meaning that evil can't exist without stealing from good. Because Satan is a metaphysically good being in the sense that he has mind, emotion, and will. He just uses it for evil purposes. But you couldn't imagine a being with no good qualities, because goodness is the essence of being. Evil is a privation in that being.
Yeah.
Evil is like anti-creation. In fact, when we do something evil, typically we're destroying something good. We're taking a good creation and destroying it. You know, in today's world, it would be like a good body and trying to mutilate your body to try and be the other gender, which is impossible. Okay. You're taking a perfectly good body and you're degrading it. You're mutilating it to try and go in a direction you want to go in, but your body isn't designed to go in. And so you're taking away from something good. That's what evil is.
Yeah, and I think too, when we're talking about it, you know, a moral argument, these things are going to come up as objections. But you know, I think it's important and worth pointing out that on a non-biblical worldview, these things that they're calling evil are actually consistent. I mean, survival of the fittest isn't necessarily a pretty thing. And if evolution created our moral understanding today, and on their worldview we're still evolving, then how can they say definitively that anything is or was ever right or wrong? It just is.
Yeah. I mean, if our goal is survival, should we rape to propagate our genes?
Right.
No, we would say no. Why? Because there's a standard outside of survival of the fittest, right? Survival of the fittest isn't the moral standard. This is why even Richard Dawkins, to his credit, says that he's not Darwinian in his morality. He doesn't like survival of the fittest. Well, too late, Richard. If your viewpoint is that there is no God, that's what you get. You get Hitler. You get Hitler trying to weed out the weaker individuals in society to create the Uber race. It's the logical outworking of atheism. And you may have noticed, too, that Richard Dawkins recently has said that, you know, he appreciates the Christian culture, and he wishes our culture would sort of return to Christianity because he doesn't want it to go down the Islamic route, you know.
Right.
Look, you can't have the flowers after you cut off the roots, right? You cut them from the roots, they're going to wilt eventually. But you want to have all the flowers after you cut the roots off. It doesn't work that way. By the way, I see somebody in the chat going, Calvinism is taught in Romans 9. No, it isn't. Romans 9 has nothing to do with selecting people to salvation. Romans 9 is the election of the nation of Israel. It's not electing Pharaoh or anybody else to salvation. You got to read this in context. It has zero to do with the election of people to salvation. That's not what it's about. He's talking about the nation of Israel. Now, every time you see the word election, he's not talking about electing certain people to salvation and others not to salvation. And there, he's talking about election in the sense of the nation of Israel.
Yeah, amen. Completely agree. So, again, it kind of brings me to the Michael Shermer debate, one of them, because, and correct me if I'm wrong, Frank, it seems like a lot of these militant atheists, they misunderstand the argument from objective morality, because a main rebuttal that Michael Shermer and a lot of atheists would do, especially in that debate, was, okay, can you think right now many reasons why it'd be wrong to molest a kid, or it would be wrong to do what Hitler does? But we're not saying that they can't think up reasons why something might be bad, or we're not saying that they can't do anything good. It's that the question, why are those thoughts even present? Why do we have morals in the first place? Can you speak to that a bit, Frank?
Yeah, it's not even about the thoughts per se. It's really more about the standard. You know, if he were to say, well, it's wrong to molest children because it harms them. Okay, stop. Why is it wrong to harm? Who said? And what is harm? Where does this come from? Right? I mean, if it's just his opinion, if there's nobody outside of him that is the standard of goodness that we're obligated to obey, why can't we do whatever we want? You know, so the problem is that atheists typically are smuggling in a moral standard. Whenever they use the word, you know, harm or benefit or good or bad or beneficial or detrimental, these are all words that are implying a standard. The question is, where is this standard if there is no God? It's just one person's opinion against another. By the way, I notice people are talking about here, James White in the, I've told James White this, but he's predestined not to agree. Okay. So there you go. By the way, if you want to see a debate between James White and Leighton Flowers, go over to Leighton Flowers' website or YouTube channel. It's called Soteriology 101. For those of you that are interested in the Calvinism Molinism or the Calvinism free will debate, check that debate out. Keep talking, Sam. I'm turning a fan on because it's 90-something degrees
problem.
here.
I think Donnie lost his connection. He'll be back in a minute. But I've got plenty of questions for you. So one question while we're still on the topic, what would you say to somebody, it may be in the position like Richard Dawkins, where maybe they feel, not that Richard Dawkins this is applicable to him, but someone who feels that they've attacked God for so long and so rigorously that maybe they're a case beyond forgiveness. What would you say to an atheist in that position?
Are there people who are beyond forgiveness? Is that the question?
Yeah.
Well, according to Romans 1, if you suppress the truth long enough, God will give you up to your own desires because he knows you're not coming back and he's a gentleman. He's going to withdraw himself from you. There may be people out there who are like that right now. We just don't know who they are. So we treat everybody as if they're redeemable. But if you suppress the truth about God long enough to go your own way and God knows you're not coming back, he will give you up to your own desires, give you up to futile thinking, give you up to the point where if you read at the end of Romans chapter 1, Paul describes our culture perfectly when he says these people are not only doing evil, they're applauding others who are doing evil.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm old enough to remember when Bill Clinton was president, when he used to say, I want abortion to be safe, legal, and rare. Now, it's celebrate your abortion. Now the Democrats are saying, hey, come to our state. We'll pay for it. Wait, how did we go from safe, legal, and rare to shout your abortion, celebrate your abortion? Because they're at the end of Romans 1.
Yeah, and
they're cheering on other people who are doing evil.
Even that conversation, abortion, when these people say that it's their body and it's their right, as if they have rights of their own over their own autonomy, that makes sense on a biblical worldview where we're all made in the image of God and we have these inalienable rights that are bestowed upon us by our Creator. But if what they mean by a right is just a law, I mean, how does that make any sense if the law?
There are no rights unless God exists. Everything's just a matter of opinion. There's not only no right to abortion, there's no right to life if there's no God. There's not only no right to same-sex marriage, there's no right to natural marriage. There's not only no trans rights, there's no human rights or Christian rights. There are no rights unless God exists. And for those of you that say in the chat, oh, that's such a lie, no one is celebrating abortion. Yeah, just go look up Gavin Newsom. Go look up Planned Parenthood. They are cheering abortion on. Go look at Andrew Cuomo. When they passed the abortion law in New York, they lit up the Empire State Building with all sorts of colors to celebrate the fact that they could kill children up to the moment of birth. They're lighting things up in celebration. So, folks in the chat, get your head out of the sand. There are people out there that are celebrating abortion.
I have two questions here back in the context of a worldview, Frank. Is atheism a default position? And are they exempt for any intellectual rigorous justification for their worldview?
So everybody has a burden of proof to show why their worldview is true. Everybody does. Christians, atheists, agnostics, Buddhists, Hindus. I mean, if you want to be reasonable, you ought to be given evidence for why you believe what you believe is true. Now, atheists will say, well, I just lack a belief. Well, if you just lack a belief, you're not telling me anything about the real world. You're just telling me something about your psychology.
Right.
You know, if I were to say I lack a belief in atheism, would that have been a positive case for theism? No. It's just telling you about my personal psychology. Who cares what my personal psychology is? What we're trying to figure out is what's really true outside of our skulls. And so regardless of who you are, you've got to, if you're going to be reasonable, you ought to give reasons for why you believe what you believe. And I have the burden of proof to tell people why I think Christianity is true. An atheist has the burden of proof to explain why the universe is and why reality the way it is in the absence of God.
That's
How do you explain how the universe got here, why it's fine-tuned, how life got here, why new life forms have come into existence, why there's objective right and wrong, why we can think and understand truths about the real world outside of our skulls? Why is there evidence that a man predicted and accomplished his own resurrection from the dead and that people went and died for this when they could have saved themselves by saying it never happened? And they knew it was true. They weren't like Muslims today who just have faith that say Islam is true. These were people that were there and knew whether Jesus had risen from the dead or not and paid for it with their lives. Why did they do this? Why do you have it? Where did all the writings of the New Testament come from? Where did this character Jesus come from? Is he a fictitious character? If he's not, who is he? You know, you have to have, let me put it this way. Where was I recently? I was on one college campus. Oh yeah, it's in a recent video we had when this young man, I think it was at the University of Buffalo, got up and he said, you know, why should we believe the New Testament documents? And, you know, they're written 100 years after, and, you know, started asking him questions. And one question I asked him was, how much reading have you done on this? Yeah. And he said, not a ton, which means nothing. Okay. Look, regardless of what you think about Jesus right now, you have to admit that Jesus is the most influential human being to ever walk the earth. If you're going to call yourself a person who is seeking truth, you have to at least investigate who this guy is or was. You have to at least study what he allegedly said and did. If you don't, you're not pursuing truth. You're not on a truth quest. You're on a happiness quest. And you're just going to believe whatever you think's going to make you happy.
They've got to deal with those prophecies also. And I've not heard anything substantive. In fact, I have Norman Geisler's big book of apologetics, and I haven't really seen him. I mean, that's a fantastic book. He covers just about everything, but I don't know that he's actually shown any atheist philosopher deal with that in a sophisticated way at all. I mean, how do they make you are very experienced in this apologetic world, Frank. What do you think is is there a sufficient response to the prophecies in the Old Testament and the fulfillments in the New Testament?
Well, atheists will say, well, either they were contrived or they're not as clear. And when they say that, sometimes they're right, because I think Christians sometimes overstate the case of prophecy. They say, well, there's 300 prophecies in the Old Testament. They're not all clear predictive prophecies. There may be allusions, but I think there are a few that when you look at, you go, wow, this is beyond coincidence, like Daniel 9, predicting the exact year when Jesus, the Messiah, would be cut off, or Isaiah 53. If you read Isaiah 53, it's really hard not to conclude this is about Jesus. And these are written hundreds of years in advance, okay? So I think there's enough there to go, yeah, there's a prophetic element to the Old Testament. But you don't need to overstate the case.
Yeah, there are some very precise, Jesus being born in a Bethlehem, seated in a manger, entering Jerusalem, betrayed, silenced before his accusers. I'm sure you're familiar with Peter Stoner.
Yeah.
And so Peter Stoner lays out how if you just have 8 of these specific prophecies fulfilled and the odds against them. Do you remember? I think it's 1 in 10 to the 17th power.
Yeah, it's a book that he wrote years ago called Science Speaks. I have it on my shelf here somewhere. But those are all using assumptions that have to be explicit, like, okay, how many people lived in Bethlehem at the time, that kind of thing. And you have to make some calculations. And if you accept what he says there, yeah, it's pretty hard to deny there's some sort of divine element to the scriptures. In fact, we just did a podcast, a couple of them just very recently, with my friend, Dr. Chip Bennett, down in Sarasota, Florida. He's a pastor and a PhD down there. And he points out that there's so many references in the Old Testament to the third day. Because, you read the New Testament, it says, particularly in 1 Corinthians 15, the ancient creed, that says that Jesus died and rose again on the third day according to the scriptures. And you're going, where is it in the Old Testament according to the scriptures? Well, if you listen to this couple of podcasts Chip and I did, you realize that the Old Testament has so many characteristics in it that couldn't be the result of contrivance. That there's so many third day references in the Old Testament that are situations where people are saved from death, like Isaac is saved on the third day, Esther's saved on the third day, the Jericho spies are saved on the third day, Joseph is saved on the third day. All these third day references, and if you're not looking for them, you're going to miss them. Yeah. Right. And how could this be contrived when these documents were written by 40 different people over 1,500 years? It couldn't be contrived. There's a divine element to the Old and New Testaments.
Yeah, Chuck Missler, he's pointed out a lot of numerical sequences. Not that you should go down that rabbit hole, but there's something there.
Mm-hmm. Well, numerical sequences, however, I don't know what Chuck's argument was, but you can get numerical sequences from any book because books are built on alphabets, which are built on math. So you could find a code in Moby Dick if you wanted to, but I don't know if that's what Chuck was talking about, because there are probably other codes you could get out of get out of the Bible. But I think we just need to be careful when we say that. Yeah, because language itself is built on mathematics. That's how you can break codes, that's how we broke the Japanese code or the Nazi code, because we could figure out mathematically what they were saying.
Gentlemen, great conversation. I apologize for that. They're doing a
How do you know, man? You weren't here. You bagged out on us.
Yeah, I got raptured. I was listening from my phone. That's good. They're doing work outside on the internet, so they warned me.
Well, okay. This question you have here, I have no idea. I haven't read Northwestern's findings, so I don't know what that means.
Looks like Donny, looks like God isn't sure if he's going to rapture him up or not.
That's right.
You back? You're still breaking up, brother.
Yeah, no, I know. They told me it's probably going to be like this for an hour. Sam, do you want to read it just in case I end up breaking up again?
Yeah, Frank already responded. He's not really sure.
I haven't read any of that, so I don't know. I'm not the guy to ask.
Okay, no problem. Here's the other super chat that came in. Did you want to briefly go over this one, Sam?
Yeah, so Frank, the question is, question for Frank, why don't you use much Bible in your debates with atheists? If faith comes by hearing and hearing by the word of God, why don't you use more of the words of God, he says.
Because most of my debates are just trying to show what's more reasonable, theism or atheism. You don't even need the Bible to show theism's more reasonable, because God has written 2 books. He's written the Bible, but he's also written the book of nature. In other words, you could look at it this way. He's written his word, but also his works. And everybody has his works: creation, conscience, morality, reason, these things. We know that there has to be a cause for all this. We have all these effects that are best explained by a cause. So I'm not, with an atheist, going to assume the Bible is true. That would be begging the question. With an atheist and an audience, I'm trying to convince that theism is the best explanation of why things are the way they are. That will later direct them to the Bible, but I'm not using the Bible as evidence in most cases, because that's the very question at hand. If I just assume the Bible's true, then I'm not really doing any work. I'm just coming to the debate saying I'm assuming what I'm trying to prove. The book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, doesn't assume the Bible's true. It tries to show it's true. Now, one of the problems in debates, and every debater will tell you this, is that you never have enough time.
That's true.
I mean, you can't even really unpack arguments. All you can do is summarize things. Typically, you have a 20-minute opening statement. Why is theism more reasonable than atheism? Well, I mean, all you can do is, I'm going to go through the cosmological, teleological, moral arguments. I may throw reason in there. I may mention there's evidence for the resurrection, right?
Yeah.
But I don't have time to get to the point where, and so therefore the Bible's the word of God. You don't have time to do that. Now, if you have a debate about the Bible, okay, that's a different thing. But most of my debates are about whether or not theism is more reasonable than atheism.
Right. That's an excellent answer. Am I coming in okay, gentlemen?
Yeah.
It sounds like
unfortunately, we can hear you.
Yeah. You make me feel so good, Frank. So I've actually heard in your encounters with some of these atheists, when it comes to the teleological argument, they'll say, well, we don't see a fine-tuned universe. And some have even said that it's not the consensus among cosmologists that, and obviously you're shaking your head, so they're wrong. I don't know where they get that, but they're basically hand waving away fine-tuning. And then they're now saying that it's not the consensus. What's a good response, Frank?
Well, they're just not reading the right stuff, because many atheists agree, including Stephen Hawking, right, who died about 6 years ago, said almost everyone, well, first of all, his quote about fine tuning, particularly with the creation of the universe itself. Well, in fact, I have his quote right here because I'm writing about it. He said this: if the expansion rate, or if the rate of expansion 1 second after the Big Bang, the creation event, had been smaller by even 1 part in 100,000 million, it would have recollapsed before it reached its present size. On the other hand, if it had been greater by a part in a million, the universe would have expanded too rapidly for stars and planets to form. So you see that even by 1 part in 100,000 million. So the expansion rate from the very beginning was fine-tuned. It's not just Hawking saying this. You'll have Martin Rees, who is a skeptic, say this. You'll have Paul Davies at Arizona State, who's an agnostic, say this. You'll have Steven Weinberg, who recently passed away, who was a staunch atheist, talking about the fine-tuning. This is why, by the way, people have come up with an alternative to this, the multiverse.
That's right.
Nobody would be talking about speculative multiple universes unless the evidence for fine-tuning was so strong. That's why they're coming up with it, to try and avoid the obvious conclusion that there must be a fine-tuner.
Yeah.
And the multiverse doesn't solve their problem because other universes would need fine tuning too. And you'd still need a cause for all these. So they're not getting rid of the problem. And by the way, when somebody says it's not the consensus view, you might say, okay, well, consensus doesn't mean it's true or false anyway. But what evidence do you have that the universe, or that many scientists are saying the universe is not fine-tuned? There's only one guy I know about who said this, and that was Victor Stenger, who was an atheist. And theists have already responded to him. So I don't know who else is saying that the universe is not fine. Even Christopher Hitchens, you know, he said, of course, he died in 2011. I had a couple of debates with him a couple of years before that, which are on our YouTube channel. Even Hitchens said, this is a serious argument, the fine tuning. It's the hardest one to talk about, the fine tuning of the universe. So I don't know why people would say it's not the consensus view. It is. And even if it wasn't, the evidence is there. The universe is fine tuned.
That's right. And like you said, even with a multiverse, the whole show requires a cause. So that's not going to save the day for them.
And that's Alexander Vilenkin, by the way, who's a believer in the multiverse. Although Vilenkin says he doesn't think the whole thing needs a cause. He says it needs a beginning. So he's trying to say it doesn't need a cause, but it still had a beginning, to which I would say, what's the odds-on favorite? If everything that comes to be has a cause, do you think the universe needs a cause? Do you think these other universes need a cause too? It would seem. I mean, why would you say it doesn't? It would seem to me, just to avoid the obvious conclusion, there must be some sort of supernatural cause out there.
You're also going to need a very finely tuned universe generating mechanism. And so where'd they get that?
Yeah, it doesn't solve the problem. It just provides an explanation that itself needs another explanation.
Right.
They're just putting the problem off a step is all they're doing.
What about people that say, well, the universe is God and we are all gods? And so they might admit to some kind of fine tuning.
So they're pantheists then.
Yeah.
Well, you know, pantheism is indistinguishable from atheism. What's the difference between saying there is no God and everything's God? There's no way to distinguish those two. It's just semantics. So they'd still have the same problem atheists have. Well, who created this whole universe then? Why is it fine-tuned? Why are there objective moral values? Why do we have consciousness? Where do these laws of logic come from? Why is there evidence of man predicting and accomplish his own resurrection from the dead? They still have the same problems.
Do all of these lines of evidence that we've been discussing here for the hour together, Frank, point to the necessity of Christianity being true? I mean, the fact that time, matter, and space came into existence from an outside force, doesn't that indicate that that outside force had to make a personal choice to bring forth the universe, meaning that the God has to be personal, which removes deism, pantheism? And so basically, again, to reiterate my question as we start to wind things down, Frank, these lines of evidence do necessitate the Christian God?
They do not necessitate the Christian God. Only the resurrection does.
Okay.
Right? There could be another God out there that's responsible for all this, that's similar to the God of the Bible. There could be a God that created the universe, fine-tuned the universe, is the objective standard of right and wrong, is the ground for logic and reason and all that. But when it gets to the crowning miracle in the New Testament, that Jesus predicted and accomplished his own resurrection from the dead, that miracle then points to the Christian God. Then we can say that the same being that walked out of the tomb 1,991 years ago is the same being in whose divine nature created the universe out of nothing. So if you don't have the resurrection, you don't know. You don't know who the ultimate God is. You know there's a creator God. You know he's moral through conscience, but you don't know if it's the God of Christianity, or you probably would know it could be just the God of Judaism. It couldn't be the God of Islam, because the God of Islam is arbitrary morally, which is why I said earlier that Calvinism makes God the author of evil. Calvinism makes God more like Allah than Yahweh, because he's morally arbitrary. And some Calvinists may push back on that, but I would ask them, how is God essentially good if he has the power to save everyone, but he doesn't?
Good question.
Right? He doesn't. God has the power to do everything that's not logically contradictory. He can't create a square circle. He can't create a one-ended stick. He can't create an honest politician, right? These things are contradictions, okay? He can't create a world where everyone believes. Well, it's logically possible he could, but it's not actually achievable with free creatures, because God can't force free creatures to do what he wants, because then they wouldn't be free. And then they wouldn't have moral accountability and they couldn't love. So while this is not the best way to this is not the best possible world, it's the best way to the best possible world, right, with free creatures.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And so what's the line that you like to say? If somebody rises from the dead, then I'm just going to believe whatever they say. That's a person I can trust in terms of
if
what
somebody predicts and accomplishes his own resurrection from the dead, I just trust whatever the guy says.
Right.
And so Jesus said the Old Testament is the word of God, and he promised the new. Why am I not going to trust him if he has already proven who he is? That's why the greatest question in the New Testament is, who do you say that I am? Right? And he gave us enough freedom to make that choice. He didn't overwhelm us with power or evidence. He wants people to make a free choice. So he gives us that ability. And that's why I think people, if you're going to consider yourself somebody who's really a truth seeker, you have to thoroughly investigate the person of Jesus. If you're just going to dismiss him, if you're going to say it's a fairy tale, if you're going to look at Christians and go, oh, they're jerks, I don't want to be a part of them, you're not being serious. You're not. And you don't want God. So God's not going to force you into heaven against your will. Right? If you don't want him now, you're not going to want him in eternity. So investigate God.
Frank, what would be a good counter to a critic here? Let's say an atheist were to say, okay, this is a circular argument. The book proves the resurrection and the resurrection proves the book. What would be a good way to respond to that?
Yeah, well, Christianity did not start with a book. Christianity started with an event, the resurrection. There were thousands of Christians before a line of the New Testament was ever written, because Christianity started with an event. The people that later wrote it down because they witnessed the resurrected Jesus.
Yeah.
Now, how else would we know about it unless they wrote it down? In other words, the New Testament writers did not create the resurrection. The resurrection created the New Testament writers. And when we investigate the resurrection, we're not taking the New Testament documents as some sort of divinely inspired text. We're just looking at the New Testament documents and other documents at the time and other evidence at the time, be it archaeology or elsewhere. We're just trying to discover if they're generally historically reliable. And this is what even atheistic scholars will do. Bart Ehrman will say there's a lot of good evidence in the New Testament, right? He's not going to write it off and say, oh, they don't have anything right. No, a lot of what they have in there is verifiable and is correct. You can't verify it all, obviously. So it's not a circular argument to say that there appears to have been an event in the first century. What records of that event do we have? Oh, let's look at those records. Let's look at other records. Let's look at archaeology. Let's look at other writers at the time. Let's see if that event really occurred. In fact, we just did a long series on the archaeological evidence in the Bible, on the big pieces of evidence. Archaeological, it's 23 hours long. And it may be a shock to learn that 7 people associated with the crucifixion of Jesus have been found in the dirt. Jesus, Peter, Simon of Cyrene, Caiaphas, the high priest, Peter, Annas, the other high priest, James, although James was an associate with the crucifixion, but he's been found as well. So that's 7. There's an 8th one. I'm trying to think of who the 8th one is right now. It's not coming to me off the top of my head. But these people have been found in the dirt. Now, this doesn't prove the resurrection has occurred necessarily, but it does show you that the people the New Testament talk, Pilate's the other one. Yeah. It does show you that the people that the New Testament talks about really existed in the capacities that the New Testament says they did. So these are historical documents. And if Genesis 1:1 is true, every other verse in the Bible is at least possible. You can't rule it out. And by the way, for those of you out there who will say, well, I can't believe in a resurrection because, I've never seen one. Look, if resurrections occurred all the time, what would the resurrection of Christ mean to us? Nothing. You go to somebody, you go, Jesus rose from the dead to prove he was God. And the guy goes, so what? Uncle George just rose from the dead 2 weeks ago. Now I got to give the inheritance back. No, it's got to be a rare event to get our attention. They can't be regular events. Miracles by definition have to be rare events. And so for atheists like David Hume, to try and say, well, since it's not a regular event, I can't believe it, is stupid. Because the very element of a miracle that makes it special, that gets your attention, is the fact that it doesn't happen all the time, is the fact that it's rare.
Yeah, we call it one book, because they're bound all together, and we call it a canon. But for the critic, though, they can't just dismiss it as one book. They've got to deal with each one of those 66 books individually. And so you can't just arbitrarily dismiss these writings of antiquity because you have a bias. Gary Habermas, he's done a lot of work on the resurrection. His minimal facts argument, he's got atheists acknowledging that someone named Jesus did resurrect. I don't know why, a glitch in the matrix maybe, but I think he's got over 1,000 pages now. His magnum opus, he calls it. Now you can get it on Amazon. Pretty impressive.
Yeah, Gary would say that more than 90% of scholars, whether they're atheist, Christian, anywhere in between, agree on a certain number of minimal facts. And among them are Jesus did die by crucifixion. His disciples believed he rose from the dead. Paul was converted. James was converted, and some other minimal facts. And even somebody like Bart Ehrman will say that he thinks that Paul had some sort of experience that made him think Jesus had resurrected from the dead. Yeah. Now, Bart doesn't think Jesus rose from the dead, but he thinks Paul thought that Jesus rose from the dead. Okay. Now, what's Bart's explanation for why Paul and others thought Jesus rose from the dead? He doesn't have one. Because any sort of counter theory he gives is fatally flawed. Hallucinations, right? Hallucinations don't happen to groups. And if people were hallucinating, they could have just gone to the empty tomb and seen it wasn't empty, right? But it was empty, right? Like Christianity could have been disproven by going to the tomb and taking Jesus's body out. Nobody could because the tomb was empty. Any other theory, and by the way, that's the most popular one, the hallucination theory. It just doesn't work. None of them work. So you know what atheistic scholars, New Testament scholars do now? They simply say, we don't know what happened, but we don't think it's a resurrection. Well, why not? Why don't you think it's a resurrection?
They have a worldview.
They have a worldview, and maybe you have to ask them individually. Maybe they just don't want to submit to what that resurrection implies.
That's right.
That resurrection implies there's a moral standard, and that Jesus has a claim on their life that they don't want to bow their knee to. Now, this might not be true of everyone, obviously, but I think it's true of some. That's why I always ask people, if Christianity were true, would you become a Christian?
Right.
And most people will say no. Not a head problem.
Heart problem.
They don't want it to be true. Okay. God's not going to force you into his presence against your will.
Amen. Great information, Frank. And we'll wrap it up with this last question. I want to make sure I get this in here. Let's promote your book a little bit, Hollywood Heroes, because it's such a fun read. It's a great read. And I love how you point to some of our favorite movies, favorite superheroes. As a superhero nerd and a Lord of the Rings fan, I really appreciate how you and your son demonstrate in this book how these characters that we love, many of us love, reveal God, but not only God, Jesus. And so I think we only have time probably for one. And so your chapter on Lord of the Rings, can you briefly speak to how Lord of the Rings, the Lord of the Rings trilogy, both the movies and the book, points to Christianity?
Well, Tolkien will tell you that because he wrote it basically as a, and some, they argue over, is this allegory? What is this? Right. But he wrote it as sort of a story that parallels Christianity, although he took all those so-called overt religious references out of it. But when you look at so much of what goes on there, in fact, what's the name of the third movie? The Return of the King?
The Return of the King, yeah.
Yeah, The Return of the King. Well, who's the king? Well, Aragorn in this case, but The Return of the King is the return of Jesus. Of course. Sam, as Tolkien said, is the hero of the entire story. And what does Sam do? Well, he carries Frodo to Mount Doom, right? He's a servant. He is someone that is going to carry his friend through anything, which is, of course, what Jesus promises to do for us, right? He's a shepherd. He's somebody that's not going to take no for an answer. He's going to help you. There's so many parallels in all of those. Lord of the Rings is just one of them. We have Star Wars. We have Iron Man, Batman, Captain America, Harry Potter. Harry Potter.
How dare you?
J.K. Rowling said she got the whole story from the Bible. I mean,
wow.
Come on, so there's parallel after parallel in all these movies, and the ultimate hero is Jesus. That's where it all points to. Amen. And when you look at Jesus, none of the characters in any of the movies completely gives you the picture of Jesus. They all give elements of Jesus, but Jesus is a character that can't be. How did we put it? It's in the last chapter. Jesus couldn't have been invented as a character. Nobody, even in fiction, has ever created a character like Jesus.
Right.
So there's just sort of literary evidence that there's something special about who Jesus is. How did these fishermen, who many of them probably couldn't even write, they had scribes, is it more likely they witnessed something or that they did something that even the greatest writers of all time couldn't do? And that is create a sinless, perfect character without it seeming contrived.
Yeah.
The more likely conclusion is they witnessed it and they just recorded it. Not that these ignorant fishermen from Israel created all this.
Amen. It reminds me of that famous t-shirt or meme where it's all the different superheroes, Iron Man, Hulk, Captain America, sitting around Jesus, because he's the true superhero.
He's right.
The true hero of the story.
That's how the book ends. That's how Hollywood Heroes ends.
Yeah.
Go check it out, friends.
And just to answer a couple skeptics in the chat. Yeah. As you're saying, Frank, you have King Aragorn, Gandalf, for example. None of them on their own represent every aspect or is analogous to every aspect of Jesus. It's parts of them. Like with Gandalf, starts off as Gandalf the Gray. He sacrifices himself, comes back as Gandalf the White. And with Aragorn, same thing. He's there as king. He doesn't reveal himself till later. And so it's a mix, you're saying, basically.
It's a mix. Yeah, I think Tolkien has spread the Jesus character among Gandalf, Aragorn, and Sam.
Yeah.
And they each have different aspects of the Jesus figure.
Yeah. And our Sam here too. He's a hero, Sam.
That's right. Yeah. Sam is the hero.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm a servant, not a hero.
Amen, brother. Amen. We're all servants here, just here to serve and here to show everybody why Christianity is true. So, Frank, I really appreciate your time. You're a true blessing. Your work in ministry have been a blessing, and you're an encyclopedia worth of information. So if anybody has not yet read your books here, I do highly recommend they check it out. Sam, excellent job co-hosting. I appreciate it. Frank, I want to throw it to you in case you had any final words, final thoughts you wanted to leave us with.
No, the only question I want to ask everybody watching is, if you're not a Christian, if Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? And if the answer's no, it's not an evidence problem. There's something else going on. And if you say, well, I don't like the God of the old, okay, that's just your personal distaste then, your personal desire. It's not an objective standard. So look, you know what could be true? What could be true is that there is a God, but it's not the God of the Bible. And then that God is the true standard. But I haven't seen any evidence that there's a God other than the God of Christianity. Yeah. You'd have to deal with all the evidence for Jesus, and you'd have to deal with all the evidence for the resurrection, and somehow say that didn't happen in order to say there's another God who hasn't apparently revealed himself yet. But to say, I'm an atheist and I think the God of the Bible is immoral, you don't have that luxury because you don't have a standard. It's just your opinion.
That's right. Great final words and final question, Frank, to leave our audience with. We appreciate how engaged the live chat was, and thanks for the questions, the challenges, and the super chats. Sam, any final words from you, brother?
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Donnie. I appreciate it. Frank, it's been a pleasure. I've really enjoyed this conversation. And yeah, to everyone else, there is not a greater question as to whether or not God is who he says he is. And so we just implore you to be rigorous in that investigation. And, you know, we're here.
That's right. And Sam, you carried the whole show because Donnie decided to take a lunch break. Okay.
Yeah. Coffee break.
Yeah, that's right.
Sam, you're getting a promotion, brother. You earned your paycheck on this one. Frank and Sam, we'll end on that note. Laughter is the best medicine. So I appreciate it. To the audience, again, thank you so much for tuning in. This has been a blast. Time has flown by. So, okay, Standing for Truth is out. God bless all.
Thanks. God bless.